January 1906. The richest family in Delaware was about to tear itself apart. Alfred the DuPont, great-great-grandson of the man who founded America's most powerful dynasty, stood in the offices of the DuPont Company and faced a choice that would cost him everything except his fortune. His family demanded he end his marriage to Alicia Maddox. They wanted him to abandon the woman he loved, stop the scandal, and preserve the family's reputation. If he refused, they would exile him from the business, from society, from every dinner table and boardroom where the DuPont name mattered. They would erase him from the family he had spent his life serving. He refused. Within months, Alfred was forced out of company leadership. Cousins who had worked beside him for decades stopped speaking to him. His own siblings turned away. Wilmington society, what if he built entirely on DuPont money and DuPont approval, closed its doors. The man who had helped build a gunpowder empire that armed the Union Army and made the family richer than most nations was suddenly invisible in his own hometown. So Alfred did what the very wealthy do when the world rejects them. He built a palace, not just a house, a statement. 300 acres, 77 rooms. A French chateau rising out of Delaware soil, grand enough to rival anything his cousins owned, beautiful enough to prove he didn't need their approval. He named it Nemours, after the family's ancestral estate in France, the place where the DuPont story began. The family that exiled him from their tables would drive past his gates every day and see exactly what they had thrown away. But the mansion that was supposed to prove Alfred's independence became the most visible symbol of his isolation. The ballroom that could hold hundreds stood empty. The dining room set for 20 served 2. The gardens designed for grand parties hosted almost no one. Nemours was supposed to be a triumph. Instead, it became the loneliest palace in America. If you love stories about grand estates, family betrayals, and the price of pride, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. In the comments, tell me which historic mansion we should explore next. Now, let's discover how one man's defiance built a palace that his own family refused to enter. Chapter 1. The Powder King's Rebellion. Alfred Irénée DuPont was born into American aristocracy in 1864, but his childhood taught him that even aristocrats could lose everything in an instant. His father, Eleuthère Irénée DuPont II, ran part of the family's gunpowder mills along the Brandywine River in Delaware. The mills were dangerous. Explosions were common. Workers died regularly, and sometimes the bosses died with them. Alfred was 13 when his mother, Charlotte, succumbed to heart disease. 2 years later, in 1877, his father was killed in a mill explosion at Hagley Yard. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows a mile away. They found pieces of Eleuthère scattered across the property. Alfred became an orphan. At 15, raised by relatives who viewed him with a mix of pity and obligation. The DuPont family operated differently from most American dynasties. There was wealth, enormous wealth, built on black powder that had fueled every American war since the Revolution. But there was also an expectation. DuPont men worked. They didn't simply inherit money and retire to estates. They learned the business from the ground up, literally. They worked in the mills, mixing powder, managing production, understanding every step of the process. It was dangerous work, but it was the family way. Alfred started in the mills at 16. He worked alongside laborers, many of whom remembered his father's death. He learned to mix powder, pack kegs, handle nitroglycerin. He was good at it, mechanically inclined, unafraid of the work that killed men regularly. By his 20s, he had risen to foreman, then supervisor, managing production at multiple mill sites. He also developed a reputation: stubborn, direct, unwilling to defer to family elders simply because they were elders. If he thought a process was inefficient or dangerous, he said so, loudly. This did not endear him to cousins who preferred tradition over innovation. In 1887, at 23, Alfred married Bessie Gardner, his second cousin. Marrying within the family was common among DuPonts. It kept wealth concentrated, simplified business partnerships, and maintained bloodlines they considered superior. Alfred and Bessie had 4 children: Madeline, Bessie Jr., Alfred Victor, and Victorine. From the outside, it looked like a standard DuPont family: respectable, prosperous, appropriate. Inside, it was hollow. Alfred and Bessie were incompatible in almost every way that mattered. She was devoutly religious, conservative, committed to social respectability above all else. He was restless, increasingly secular, uninterested in the endless social rituals that defined Wilmington's elite circles. They stayed together because that's what DuPonts did. Divorce was unthinkable. Scandal was worse than unhappiness. Alfred threw himself into work. In 1902, the family patriarch Eugene DuPont died. The company faced a crisis. Several older cousins wanted to sell DuPont to a competitor. The business that had sustained the family for a century was about to be liquidated for cash. Alfred, then 38, refused to let it happen. He rallied two younger cousins, T. Coleman DuPont and Pierre S. DuPont, and together they bought out the older generation. The three cousins restructured the company, modernized production, expanded into new markets, and turned DuPont into one of the largest chemical companies in the world. Alfred became a vice president and director. He managed production facilities, developed new products, and earned respect from workers who appreciated his willingness to visit mill floors and listen to concerns. But inside the family, tensions grew. Coleman and Pierre were smooth, politically astute, skilled at boardroom maneuvering. Alfred was blunt, impatient with corporate politics, more comfortable with machinery than diplomacy. He and Pierre began to clash over strategy, spending, control. Then in 1904, something worse than business disagreements entered his life. He met Alicia Bradford Maddox, his distant cousin and his sister-in-law. She was beautiful, intelligent, trapped in her own unhappy marriage. They fell in love. In 1906, both divorced their spouses. The scandal exploded immediately. Wilmington society did not tolerate divorce. The DuPont family certainly didn't tolerate it, especially when it involved two family members leaving their marriages for each other. Alfred's siblings issued an ultimatum: end the relationship with Alicia or face social exile. His cousins in the company, led by Pierre, joined the pressure campaign. Alfred refused. He married Alicia in October 1907. The family made good on its threat. His brother shut him out. His sisters stopped speaking to him. Coleman and Pierre maneuvered him out of active leadership in the company. He kept his position as vice president and his stock. They couldn't take those. But real power shifted away from him. The doors of Wilmington society closed. Invitations stopped coming. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to him. Alfred was 43 years old, worth millions, and suddenly invisible in the only world he had ever known. So he decided to build a new world, one his family couldn't ignore. Chapter 2. The Château on Brandywine. Alfred purchased 300 acres north of Wilmington in 1907, land that had once been part of the family's original estate. The location was deliberate. Every DuPont who drove north from the city would pass directly by his gates. They would see what he was building, whether they wanted to or not. This would not be a modest country house. It would be a statement rendered in limestone, steel, and glass. He hired Carrère and Hastings, one of America's premier architectural firms. John Mervyn Carrère and Thomas Hastings had designed the New York Public Library, established themselves as masters of Beaux-Arts style, and worked almost exclusively for the country's wealthiest families. They understood that great houses were not just buildings, they were declarations of power, taste, and permanence. Alfred gave them a clear vision. He wanted a French château modeled after the DuPont family's ancestral home in Nemours, France. The original Nemours had been a medieval fortress, later expanded into an elegant estate. Alfred's version would honor that legacy while incorporating every modern convenience 1908 technology could provide. It would be grand enough to rival any home his cousins owned, with one critical difference. This would be his alone, built with his money, designed to his specifications, filled with guests he chose rather than family obligations forced upon him. Construction began in early 1908. Carrère and Hastings designed a 5-story mansion in the style of a Louis XVI chateau. The house exterior would be faced with Indiana limestone, glowing warm gold in sunlight. The roof would be steeply pitched with prominent dormers, following classical French design. Tall windows would line every floor, flooding interiors with natural light. A porte-cochere also would shelter arriving carriages and later automobiles. The floor plan was ambitious. 77 rooms spanning approximately 47,000 square feet. The main block of the house would contain formal spaces, living room, dining room, library, music room, billiard room, all with 14 to 15-foot ceilings. The east wing would hold service areas, kitchens, pantries, laundry facilities. The west wing would contain a two-story conservatory filled with tropical plants and exotic flowers. Upper floors would have family bedrooms, each with private bathrooms, a luxury many grand houses still lacked. Guest suites, servants' quarters, storage rooms, linen closets, everything needed to operate a completely self-sufficient household. But the real centerpiece was the ballroom. Alfred insisted on a space that could host hundreds. The room that Carrère and Hastings designed measured 50 feet long with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, parquet floors, and French doors opening onto formal gardens. It was large enough for orchestras, dancing, receptions that would rival anything held in Newport or New York. Alfred wanted to prove he could host society, even if society refused to come. The entrance hall set the tone for the entire mansion. White marble floors imported from Italy, a grand staircase rising to the second floor, walls paneled in French walnut, ornate plasterwork on the ceilings. Visitors would step inside and immediately understand this was not simply a wealthy man's house. This was a palace. Materials came from across the globe, marble from Italy and France, woodwork carved in Europe and shipped to Delaware, stained glass windows from studios in Paris, tapestries from Belgium, fireplaces designed and built in England, bronze fixtures cast in New York. Every detail was specified, approved, and installed under Alfred's watchful supervision. The gardens were equally elaborate. Alfred hired a landscape architect to design 200 acres of formal gardens, walking paths, reflecting pools, fountains, statuary, and a sunken garden modeled after Versailles. A long alley of trees would lead from the mansion to a reflecting pool. Terraced gardens would cascade down slopes. Rare plants would be imported and cultivated in the conservatory, then transplanted outdoors. The estate would bloom continuously from spring through fall. A 9-foot wall encircled the entire property, not just for privacy, but for security. Alfred had made enemies, both within his family and in the labor disputes that plagued early 20th century industry. The wall sent a clear message. This was private property. Trespassers were unwelcome. The outside world had rejected him, so he built a world they couldn't enter. Construction employed hundreds of workers over 3 years. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, electricians, plumbers, painters, glaziers, landscapers, all labored to bring Alfred's vision into existence. He paid well, visited the site regularly, and demanded perfection. If a piece of woodwork wasn't right, it was torn out and replaced. If a marble panel had the slightest flaw, it was rejected and a new one ordered. Cost was irrelevant. This had to be flawless. The final accounting exceeded $2 million, roughly equivalent to $60 million today. That covered construction alone, not furnishings, art, or the extensive gardens. When furniture, rugs, paintings, sculptures, and landscaping were added, the total approached $3 million, nearly $90 million in modern currency. It was one of the most expensive private residences built in America during that era, rivaling Vanderbilt estates and matching the grandest homes of the Gilded Age. Nemours was completed in 1910. Alfred and Alicia moved in that summer with her young daughter from her previous marriage. The house that was supposed to heal Alfred's exile was finished. Now the question was whether anyone would ever come. Chapter 3. The Palace. Nobody visited the first dinner party at Nemours seated 7 people. Alfred, Alicia, her daughter, and 4 friends, carefully chosen because they had remained loyal during the divorce scandal. The dining room could accommodate 20 comfortably, 30 if needed. The table was set with Limoges china, sterling silver, crystal from Baccarat. Servants moved quietly between kitchen and dining room, presenting courses with practiced efficiency. The meal was impeccable. The conversation was strained. Alfred kept inviting people. He sent invitations to business associates, to distant relatives who hadn't openly condemned him, to Wilmington residents who might overlook the scandal in favor of curiosity about the new mansion. Some accepted, most declined. The ones who came toured the house with appropriate expressions of awe, complimented the architecture, and rarely returned. The ballroom stood empty. Alfred had built it imagining grand receptions. Wilmington society forced to acknowledge his triumph. Instead, the crystal chandeliers hung over polished floors that echoed with silence. The orchestra pit remained unused. The French doors opened onto formal gardens, where no garden parties assembled. It was the largest, most expensive, unused space in Delaware. Alfred's children from his first marriage refused to visit. His eldest daughter, Madeline, particularly despised Alicia, blamed her for the destruction of her parents' marriage, and made her feelings public. She inherited her mother Bessie's rigid sense of propriety and saw her father's remarriage as betrayal. His son, Alfred Victor, sided with his mother as well. Only the younger children maintained occasional contact, and even that was distant and formal. His siblings remained estranged. His brother Maurice refused all communication. His sisters maintained polite silence, which in DuPont society was its own form of condemnation. Cousins who had worked alongside him for decades acted as if he had ceased to exist. At DuPont Company board meetings, Pierre and Coleman spoke around him rather than to him. He voted his shares, collected his dividends, and watched power consolidate in Pierre's hands. Wilmington society treated Nemours as invisible. The mansion was too grand, too new, too expensive to ignore architecturally. But socially, it simply wasn't acknowledged. The garden club didn't request tours. The historical society didn't include it in heritage discussions. Newspapers mentioned it briefly when construction finished, then moved on. For all its grandeur, Nemours existed in social silence. Alfred tried to fill the void with activity. He threw himself into business investments separate from DuPont Company. He supported local causes, funded schools, donated to churches. He hoped generosity might soften attitudes. It didn't. Wilmington society had made its decision. Alfred DuPont had violated fundamental rules. No amount of limestone and French tapestries would restore him. Alicia navigated the isolation with more grace than Alfred managed. She had expected exile. She knew what marrying him would cost. She made the house comfortable for the three of them, her, Alfred, and her daughter. She cultivated the gardens, played piano in the music room, hosted the small dinners that Alfred's pride demanded. She tried to make Nemours feel like a home rather than a fortress. But a house built for society events and grand receptions cannot help but feel empty when it holds only 3 people. The servants outnumbered the residents. A full-time staff of 60 maintained the mansion, grounds, and stables. Cooks, housekeepers, maids, footmen, valets, gardeners, groundskeepers, chauffeurs, stablemen. They kept Nemours immaculate, ready at all times for guests, who mostly didn't come. The loneliness showed in small ways. Alfred developed a habit of walking the gardens alone at night. Staff reported seeing him pacing the alleys, smoking cigars, staring at the reflecting pools. He began spending more time in his study, working late into the night on business correspondence, investments, legal matters, anything that kept his mind occupied. He started collecting art and rare books, filling the mansion with objects, if not people. He also began having health problems. He had always been somewhat deaf, the result of decades working near mill explosions. By his late 40s, his hearing had deteriorated significantly. He required people to speak loudly and directly. This made social interactions even more difficult. Conversation in the echoing rooms of Nemours became awkward, forced, exhausting. The isolation affected Alicia too, though she spoke about it less. She had left her first husband expecting a new life with Alfred, assuming his wealth and position would protect them. Instead, she found herself mistress of a palace, without a court. She maintained dignity, refused to show hurt publicly, but friends noticed she rarely smiled anymore. By 1913, 5 years after construction began, Nemours had become exactly what Alfred's family hoped it would be. Not a triumph, but an expensive monument to stubbornness. A palace that proved you could have everything money could buy and still have nothing that mattered. The house stood perfect and empty, the most beautiful expression of loneliness in America. Chapter 4. The War That Changed Everything. April 1917. The United States entered World War I, and overnight Alfred DuPont became essential again. The DuPont Company was America's largest producer of gunpowder and explosives. When war came, the military needed black powder, smokeless powder, dynamite, TNT, everything DuPont made. Personal feuds became irrelevant. Pierre needed Alfred's expertise in production, and the government needed DuPont to operate at maximum capacity. Alfred returned to active involvement in the company. Not as a senior executive, Pierre had consolidated that power permanently, but as a technical advisor and production supervisor. He knew the mills better than anyone. He had worked them as a teenager, managed them as a young man, and designed improvements throughout his career. When production had to increase 500%, when new facilities had to be built in months instead of years, Pierre turned to Alfred. It wasn't reconciliation, it was necessity. The two cousins coordinated through intermediaries when possible, spoke tersely when meetings were unavoidable, and maintained cold professionalism throughout. But they worked together because the alternative was failing the nation during wartime. Alfred accepted the arrangement. Not because he forgave Pierre, but because work, real work with tangible goals and clear problems to solve, was better than empty rooms at Nemours. The war transformed DuPont Company. Revenue exploded. The workforce expanded to over 85,000 employees. New facilities appeared across the eastern United States. Military contracts exceeded anything the company had seen in a century of operation. Profits during the war years were astronomical, and as a major shareholder, Alfred benefited enormously. His personal fortune, already substantial, grew exponentially. But the war also brought loss. Young men from Delaware families, including distant DuPont relations, were killed in France. Workers at DuPont facilities died in explosions and accidents as production was pushed beyond safe limits. Alfred, who had always taken mill safety seriously, watched corners being cut in the name of wartime urgency. It bothered him, but he couldn't stop it. The military needed explosives. Men would die making them. That was simply the mathematics of war. His hearing continued to deteriorate. By 1918, he was functionally deaf in one ear and severely impaired in the other. Conversations required shouting or written notes. Telephone calls became impossible. He increasingly relied on Alicia to manage social interactions, dinner conversations, and any situation requiring understanding multiple voices at once. His isolation deepened, not from social exile now, but from physical reality. The world was becoming quieter around him, whether he wanted it to be or not. In late 1920, Alicia died. She had been ill for months, though she rarely complained. The cause was circulatory failure, likely heart disease that had gone untreated. She was only 43 years old. Alfred had been with her less than 15 years, and now she was gone too. He buried her in the DuPont family cemetery, despite objections from relatives who still considered her an outsider. For months after her death, Alfred barely left Nemours. Staff reported he spent hours in the conservatory, where Alicia had loved to sit among the tropical plants. He had the mansion maintained immaculately, but saw almost no one. Invitations to business dinners went unanswered. Correspondence piled up. He was 56 years old, enormously wealthy, living in a palace designed for entertaining, and utterly alone. Then in 1921, he met Jessie Ball. She was a teacher from Virginia, 20 years younger than Alfred, educated, intelligent, practical. She had known Alfred years earlier when she was a child, and he was a young man working in the mills. Her family had worked for DuPonts. She had grown up on the periphery of that world, close enough to understand it, but not part of it. They corresponded for months before Alfred asked her to visit Nemours. She came, toured the mansion, walked the gardens, and saw clearly what Alfred had built and what it had cost him. She didn't flinch from either reality. When he proposed, she accepted, knowing exactly what she was entering. A marriage to a deaf, isolated, stubborn man who carried decades of family wounds and lived in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. They married in 1921. Jessie Ball DuPont, as she became, approached Nemours with completely different energy than Alicia had. Alicia had been gracious and dignified, trying to make the best of exile. Jessie was determined to make the mansion actually function. She didn't care whether Wilmington society approved. She invited who she wanted, hosted dinners and events on her terms, and transformed Nemours from a monument to wounded pride into something closer to an actual home. She also became Alfred's interpreter, literally. As his hearing worsened, she learned to manage conversations, repeating what people said, clarifying questions, ensuring Alfred could participate. She didn't hide his deafness or apologize for it. She simply worked around it with matter-of-fact efficiency. Alfred, for his part, seemed to come alive again. He returned to active business pursuits, invested in Florida real estate and banking, and developed projects separate from the DuPont company. He and Pierre remained estranged, but Alfred no longer seemed consumed by that estrangement. Jessie had given him something Alicia couldn't, not just companionship, but purpose beyond grievance. Nemours filled with activity again, not grand society events. Alfred had long since accepted those would never happen, but gatherings of people Alfred and Jessie chose. Business associates, Jessie's family, friends from Virginia, educators Jessie knew from her teaching career. The mansion started feeling used, lived in, less like a fortress and more like a grand house that happened to be occupied by complicated people. The ballroom remained mostly empty, but the dining room saw regular use. The conservatory bloomed under Jessie's attention. The guest suites hosted visitors who actually wanted to be there rather than felt obligated. It wasn't the social triumph Alfred had envisioned when construction began, but it was something better. It was real. Chapter 5. The final chapter. Alfred's health declined through the 1930s. His deafness was total by then. Conversation required writing everything down, passing notes back and forth, slow and frustrating for everyone involved. He developed diabetes, a serious condition in an era before insulin was widely available. His mobility decreased. The man who had once worked alongside laborers in dangerous powder mills could barely walk the gardens he had designed. He and Pierre finally reconciled, sort of. In 1934, after nearly 30 years of estrangement, the cousins agreed to a truce brokered by family members tired of the feud. They met briefly, exchanged stiff pleasantries, and agreed to stop actively undermining each other. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even warmth, but it was an end to open hostility, which was something. Alfred threw his energy into his will and his legacy. He had no children with either Alicia or Jessie. His children from his first marriage remained distant. So he decided his fortune would serve broader purposes. He established the Nemours Foundation with instructions to use the estate for children's health care. He wanted a hospital built on the grounds, a place where children, regardless of their family's ability to pay, could receive the best medical care available. He died on January 28, 1935, at 70 years old at Nemours. The funeral was private. Family members attended, some of the same people who had refused to speak to him for decades. Wilmington society sent flowers and condolences, suddenly remembering his contributions to Delaware now that he was safely dead. He was buried in the DuPont cemetery next to Alicia. Jessie became executor of his estate and guardian of his final wishes. The Nemours Foundation she established in 1936 began the work Alfred had outlined. A children's hospital was built on the Nemours property, opening in 1940. It provided pediatric care without regard for families' financial situations, funded entirely by Alfred's fortune. Over the following decades, it treated tens of thousands of children, many of whom would have received no care otherwise. Jessie lived at Nemours until her death in 1970. She maintained the mansion exactly as Alfred had wanted it, preserved the gardens, managed the foundation, and ensured his vision for the estate became reality. She opened Nemours for occasional tours, allowed researchers to study the architecture and grounds, but kept it primarily as a private residence. It was her home for nearly 50 years, and she protected it fiercely. When Jessie died, the mansion faced an uncertain future. It was expensive to maintain, nearly 50,000 square feet, requiring constant care. The gardens needed full-time staff. Heating and cooling costs were enormous. The Nemours Foundation had to decide whether to preserve it as a museum or sell it and redirect resources to the hospital. They chose preservation. In 1977, after years of legal work, restoration, and planning, Nemours opened to the public as a house museum. Tours were limited, capacity restricted, but for the first time since Alfred built it, outsiders could walk the halls he had designed, see the rooms he had furnished, and stand in the ballroom that had waited 70 years for crowds that never came during his lifetime. Today, Nemours operates as a historic estate and garden. The mansion is preserved as it looked during Alfred and Jessie's residence, rooms carefully maintained with original furniture, art, and decorative objects. The gardens remain some of the finest formal French gardens in America, 200 acres of designed landscape, rivaling anything created during the Gilded Age. The Nemours Children's Hospital, now located nearby but separate from the original estate, has grown into one of the leading pediatric facilities on the East Coast. It treats children from across the region, fulfilling exactly the mission Alfred outlined in his will. The hospital that grew from his fortune has touched more lives than the mansion ever could. Approximately 15,000 visitors tour Nemours annually. They walk through rooms Alfred furnished but rarely filled. They admire the ballroom, where society events never happened. They stroll gardens designed for parties that were mostly canceled. And they hear the story of a man who built a palace to prove he didn't need his family's approval, only to discover that no amount of limestone and crystal could fill the absence left by exile. Chapter 6. What It All Meant. Stand in the entrance hall of Nemours today, and you see marble floors, a grand staircase, walls paneled in imported wood. You see wealth, taste, architectural achievement. What you don't immediately see is loneliness, but it's there in every room. The dining room table seats 20. For most of Alfred's life, it held 4 or 5. The ballroom accommodates hundreds. It hosted maybe a dozen events while he lived. The guest suites upstairs number 10. Most stayed empty year after year. Nemours was designed for a social life Alfred never had after he built it. This makes it different from other Gilded Age mansions. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore and filled it with guests. Hearst built San Simeon and turned it into a constant party. The Rockefellers built Kikewood and used it for generations of family gatherings. These houses, however problematic or excessive, served their intended purposes. They were homes, however grand. Nemours was revenge architecture. Alfred built it to show his family what they had rejected, to prove his wealth, his taste, his refinement despite the divorce scandal, to demonstrate he could create something as magnificent as anything his cousins owned. He succeeded completely in the construction and failed completely in the outcome. The house that was supposed to vindicate him instead became evidence of his isolation. There's a darker reading, too. Nemours represents what happens when family power becomes more important than individual happiness. Alfred's crime in his family's eyes wasn't that he divorced or even that he remarried. It was that he did those things without permission, without considering what it would do to the DuPont name, without prioritizing family cohesion over personal desire. The DuPonts in 1906 were American aristocracy. They had survived for a century by maintaining discipline, presenting a united front, and never letting individual scandal threaten collective reputation. Alfred's divorce and remarriage threatened all of that. So they cut him out, completely and permanently, because the alternative was admitting that individual happiness might matter more than family image. Alfred could have responded by leaving Wilmington entirely, moving to New York or Philadelphia or Europe, anywhere the DuPont shadow didn't reach. Instead, he stayed, built Nemours 5 miles from family estates, and forced them to see what they had rejected every day. That wasn't healing. That was a wound kept deliberately open. Yet there's also something genuine in Nemours. Alfred loved Alicia. He married Jessie. He created a hospital for children. He employed hundreds of workers. He built something beautiful that has lasted more than a century. The house wasn't just spite, it was also hope. Hope that beauty and grandeur would somehow compensate for the family dinners that didn't happen, the children who didn't visit, the society that didn't care. Jessie Ball DuPont understood this better than anyone. She lived in that tension for 35 years after Alfred died, maintaining a house built in anger, but trying to fill it with purpose. She didn't pretend Nemours was perfect, or that Alfred's choices had been simple. She just worked with what existed, preserved what mattered, and ensured the fortune that built the mansion ultimately served people who needed help. That's probably the real legacy of Nemours. Not the architecture as fine as it is, not the gardens, as beautiful as they remain. The legacy is that Alfred's complicated, wounded pride ultimately funded something good. The Children's Hospital has treated hundreds of thousands of patients. The foundation supports education, medical research, and historic preservation. The mansion exists as a reminder that wealth doesn't have to disappear when the people who created it die. It can be redirected towards something useful. Would Alfred have preferred a house full of family and laughter to a hospital that bears his name? Probably, but you don't always get to choose between perfect outcomes. Sometimes you choose between making the best of a bad situation or letting bitterness consume everything. Alfred, with Jessie's help, eventually chose the former. Nemours stands in Wilmington today as a monument to many things. Gilded age excess, yes. Family cruelty, certainly, but also resilience. Alfred didn't let exile destroy him. He built something anyway. And Jessie, carrying forward after his death, ensured that something became more than just an empty gesture. She made it matter. That's rarer than you might think. Most revenge architecture just sits there, expensive and pointless, until it's demolished or repurposed without anyone caring about the original builder's intentions. Nemours survived and evolved because people who came after Alfred cared enough to preserve both the structure and the mission. They took his wounded pride and transformed it into something that actually helps people. Maybe that's the best outcome anyone could ask for from a palace built by loneliness. Chapter 7. Inside the Mansion. A day at Nemours. Walk through Nemours on a typical day in 1925, and you would encounter a small army of people keeping the mansion alive. 60 staff members worked full-time. Not just worked, lived on the property in staff quarters built specifically to house them. This wasn't a house. It was a self-contained operation requiring the coordination of a luxury hotel. The morning began at 5 a.m. in the kitchen. The head cook, assisted by 2 kitchen maids, started preparing breakfast. Fresh bread baked daily, coffee brewed in large silver pots, eggs, bacon, fresh fruit. Pastries, everything made from scratch. By 7:30 a.m., breakfast was ready whether Alfred and his household ate it promptly or not. Timing was everything. Food served cold was failure. While the kitchen worked, housemaids moved through the mansion's 77 rooms. Fireplaces were cleaned of yesterday's ash and reset with new wood. Floors were swept and mopped. Furniture was dusted. Linens were changed. Windows were washed. Brass fixtures were polished. The white marble floors in the entrance hall were scrubbed on hands and knees until they gleamed. This happened every single day, whether guests were expected or not, whether Alfred noticed or not. The standard was perfection, and perfection required constant labor. The conservatory demanded specialized attention. A full-time gardener maintained the tropical plants, orchids, ferns, and exotic flowers that filled the 2-story glass room. Temperature had to be monitored constantly. Too hot and plants wilted. Too cold and they died. Watering, pruning, fertilizing, pest control. The conservatory was a full-time job in itself. Outside, 8 groundskeepers maintained the 200 acres of formal gardens. Lawns were mowed weekly during growing season. Hedges were trimmed into precise geometric shapes. Flower beds were weeded daily. The reflecting pools were cleaned and refilled. Fountains required maintenance. Statuary needed regular washing. Tree branches had to be pruned. Fallen leaves were raked immediately. The gardens were meant to look effortless. That required enormous effort. The stables employed 4 men. Even after automobiles became common, Alfred kept horses for riding and ceremonial purposes. Stalls had to be mucked daily. Horses fed, groomed, exercised. Tack cleaned and oiled. Carriages maintained even though they were rarely used. The garage, added later, housed multiple automobiles that also required care. Chauffeurs kept the cars immaculate, engines tuned, ready to depart at a moment's notice. A full-time electrician maintained the mansion's electrical systems. Nemours had been wired with the most modern technology available in 1910, but that technology required constant attention. Light bulbs needed replacing, and the mansion had hundreds of them. Circuits needed checking. The coal-fired boilers that heated the house required daily monitoring and adjustment. Laundry was a dedicated operation. 2 women worked full-time washing linens, towels, napkins, tablecloths, curtains, clothing. Everything was washed by hand or in early washing machines, hung to dry or pressed with heavy irons, heated on stoves. A household of Nemours' size generated mountains of laundry weekly. The butler managed the household staff, coordinated meals, answered doors, supervised table service, and ensured Alfred's daily life ran smoothly. His wife, the housekeeper, managed the female staff, ordered supplies, maintained household inventories, and handled 1,000 details Alfred never saw. These two positions required people who were part manager, part psychologist, part diplomat. Staff conflicts had to be resolved, problems anticipated. The household had to function invisibly. Alfred's valet handled his clothing, laying out clothes each morning, maintaining wardrobes, packing for trips, ensuring shoes were polished, hats brushed, everything pressed and ready. As Alfred's hearing deteriorated, the valet also learned to serve as a silent assistant, anticipating needs Alfred couldn't easily communicate. The cost of operating Nemours was staggering. Annual expenses exceeded $500,000 in the 1920s, roughly $8 million in modern currency. That covered staff salaries, food, fuel, maintenance, supplies, utilities, everything required to keep the mansion functioning. And this didn't include major repairs, renovations, or improvements. Those came from separate accounts. For most of the year, this entire operation existed to serve three people: Alfred, Jessie, and occasionally her daughter. 60 staff members maintaining 47,000 square feet for a household of three. The mathematics were absurd, but that was the nature of grand estates. They required infrastructure wildly disproportionate to actual occupancy. Dinner was the formal center of each day. Even when no guests attended, dinner was served with full ceremony. The table set with Limoges china, sterling silver, crystal glasses. Multiple courses prepared and presented. Wine served. Alfred and Jessie dressed formally and dined in the grand dining room designed for 20. Afterward, they might move to the music room where Jessie played piano, or to the library where Alfred read, though reading became harder as his eyesight failed along with his hearing. The mansion was warmest in these evening hours. Not physically warm, the massive rooms were hard to heat even with every fireplace blazing and boilers running full, but warm with actual human use. This was when Nemours felt closest to being a home rather than a museum. Then night came. Staff retired to their quarters. Lights were turned off in most rooms. The house settled into darkness and silence. Only a few night lamps remained lit in case Alfred or Jessie needed something. Security guards patrolled the grounds, checking locks, watching for intruders, ensuring the 9-foot wall kept the world out. In those quiet hours, Nemours revealed its fundamental nature. It was a machine designed to project grandeur, operated by dozens of people, consuming enormous resources, all to maintain the fiction that one man's exile could be made beautiful. The staff knew this. They saw the empty guest rooms, the unused ballroom, the dining table set for crowds that didn't come. But they kept the machine running because that was their job, and Alfred paid well, treated them fairly, and gave them security in an uncertain world. For them, Nemours wasn't a symbol of loneliness or family betrayal. It was employment. A paycheck. A place to live and work that beat most alternatives available to working-class Americans in the 1920s and 30s. They were part of Alfred's grand statement, whether they understood it or not, and they kept it immaculate because that's what professionals did. Chapter 8. Jessie's Transformation. When Jessie Ball DuPont died in January 1970, she left explicit instructions. Nemours would become a museum. Not immediately. The transition required careful planning, but eventually. The mansion, gardens, furnishings, everything would be preserved exactly as they existed during her residence. Future generations would walk these halls and see precisely how Alfred and Jessie had lived. But first came legal complications. Alfred's will had established the Nemours Foundation, primarily to operate the children's hospital. The mansion was included in the foundation's assets, but its specific future remained somewhat ambiguous. Jessie's will clarified that ambiguity, but her instructions raised new questions. How would the foundation balance operating a hospital with maintaining a historic house? Museum? What about ongoing costs? Who would manage tours? What about insurance, security, preservation? The foundation spent 5 years answering these questions. Lawyers drafted governance documents. Architects and preservationists assessed the mansion's condition. Curators inventoried furnishings and art. Landscape architects evaluated the gardens. Financial analysts projected operating costs. The goal was to open Nemours as a museum that could sustain itself long-term without draining resources from the hospital. The mansion needed work. 70 years of occupation, even careful occupation, created wear. Paint had faded. Woodwork needed restoration. Some furniture required repair. Fabrics had deteriorated. The electrical system needed updating to meet modern code. Plumbing required attention. The roof needed replacement in sections. Climate control had to be installed to protect furnishings from Delaware's humid summers. The restoration began in 1974. Craftsmen studied original construction documents, matched materials, replicated techniques. When paint was refreshed, colors were matched to Alfred's original specifications. Damaged woodwork was repaired by carvers who understood Beaux-Arts detailing. Upholstery was replaced with fabrics matching period-appropriate patterns. Rugs were cleaned and conserved. Chandeliers were rewired and restored. The conservatory presented special challenges. The glass structure had leaked for years. Metal framework corroded. Plant collections Jessie maintained had grown wild. The entire space required complete reconstruction. New glass, repaired metalwork, rebuilt interior planters. Historic photographs guided restoration. The goal was returning the conservatory to its 1920s appearance, while incorporating modern systems to control temperature and humidity. Gardens received similar attention. Decades of maintenance had kept them alive, but restoration required more. Historic landscape plans were consulted, original plantings were researched. Hardscaping, paths, walls, stairs, was repaired. The reflecting pool was drained, cleaned, waterproofed, and refilled. Fountains were rebuilt with modern pumps hidden to maintain period appearance. Statuary was cleaned and conserved. The ballroom, unused for decades, became a focal point. Here was the room that symbolized Alfred's frustrated dreams. Tour planners decided to present it honestly. The room Alfred built hoping for society events that never came, preserved now for visitors he never met. Chandeliers were cleaned, floors refinished, French doors opening to the gardens were restored. The space was staged as if ready for a party that would finally, 70 years late, arrive in the form of museum tours. In 1976, trial tours began. Small groups, mostly foundation donors and Delaware officials, walked through accompanied by trained docents. The feedback shaped final preparations. Visitors wanted to understand not just what they were seeing, but why it existed. The family story, the divorce scandal, Alfred's isolation, Jessie's role. The tours needed narrative, not just architectural description. May 1st, 1977, Nemours officially opened to the public. Advanced reservations required. Tours limited to 20 people. No children under 12 admitted. The furnishings were too fragile for young visitors. Photography restricted. Strict rules against touching anything. The foundation was determined to preserve Nemours for future generations, which meant controlling present access. Initial response was strong. Delaware residents curious about the mansion they'd driven past for decades booked tours immediately. Architectural historians came to study Carrère and Hastings' work. Garden enthusiasts wanted to see the formal French landscaping. Visitors interested in Gilded Age history added Nemours to trips that included other grand estates. But operating a house museum proved challenging. Annual costs exceeded $1 million by the 1980s. Climate control alone was expensive. Keeping 47,000 square feet at stable temperature and humidity year-round consumed enormous energy. Staff expenses remained high. Docents, maintenance workers, gardeners, security, administration. Admission fees covered only a fraction of operating costs. The foundation subsidized the difference, drawing from the endowment Alfred established. Questions arose about mission. Was maintaining a millionaire's mansion the best use of resources that could fund pediatric care? Some foundation board members argued for closing the museum and redirecting funds to the hospital. Others insisted Alfred's will mandated preservation. The debate was sharp and recurring. What settled the argument was recognizing that Nemours served educational purposes beyond displaying wealth. It documented early 20th century architecture and design. It preserved gardens that were increasingly rare as suburban development consumed similar estates. It illustrated American social history, class structures, domestic service, family dynamics among industrial elite, and it provided context for understanding the foundation itself. Alfred's complicated legacy, his wounded pride, and eventual generosity made more sense when you could walk through the house that embodied both impulses. The museum also became an economic asset to Delaware. Tourists visiting Nemours spent money at local hotels, restaurants, shops. The estate employed people directly and supported service industries indirectly. Historic preservation generated goodwill and positive attention. Wilmington, often overshadowed by Philadelphia, could point to Nemours as evidence of cultural significance. By the 1990s, Nemours had settled into steady operation. Annual visitorship stabilized around 15,000. Not huge numbers. Many historic houses attracted far more, but sustainable given the foundation's capacity and the mansion's fragility. The limited access actually enhanced the experience. Visitors who made reservations weeks in advance traveled to Wilmington specifically to see Nemours, arrived prepared to appreciate what they encountered. The tours evolved. Early presentations focused heavily on architecture and furnishings. Later tours incorporated more social history, Alfred's life, the divorce scandal, his relationship with family, Jessie's role, the hospital legacy. Docents were trained to present Alfred neither as villain nor hero, but as complicated, brilliant in some ways, stubborn in others, wounded by rejection, but capable of eventually channeling hurt toward useful purposes. Special programming expanded, garden tours during spring and summer when plantings peaked, holiday tours in December when the mansion was decorated, behind-the-scenes tours showing areas normally closed, educational programs for college students studying architecture, landscape design, or history. The house that Alfred built for social events that never happened finally became a gathering place, just not the kind he imagined. Jessie would have approved. She understood better than Alfred that Nemours mattered not because of its grandeur, but because of what it preserved: memory, craftsmanship, beauty, history. She ensured the house survived so future generations could learn from Alfred's choices, both wise and foolish. That was her final gift to him, protecting his legacy while transforming it into something educational rather than merely ostentatious. Chapter 9. The Restoration Challenge. By 2005, Nemours faced a crisis. The mansion was nearly 100 years old. Systems installed in Alfred's time had long since been replaced, but now those replacements needed replacement. The roof leaked despite multiple repairs. Windows, even those restored in the 1970s, failed. The foundation showed concerning cracks. Climate control struggled to maintain stable conditions. The house needed comprehensive restoration, estimated at $25 million. The Nemours Foundation Board debated options. Spend $25 million on a historic house when that money could fund years of pediatric care, or allow one of Delaware's most significant historic properties to deteriorate. The decision would define the foundation's priorities for the next generation. They chose restoration, not just because Alfred's will arguably required it, but because letting Nemours decline served no one. The investment would be significant but manageable within the foundation's resources, and comprehensive restoration now would prevent more expensive crisis repairs later. Planning took 3 years. Preservation architects assessed every structural system. The analysis revealed problems worse than initially thought. Original steel beams showed corrosion. Limestone exterior had cracked and spalled in dozens of locations. The conservatory's glass structure was failing again. Electrical and plumbing systems were inadequate and potentially dangerous. The work couldn't be piecemeal. It had to be systematic and thorough. In 2008, Nemours closed to public tours. The mansion would remain closed for almost 4 years while restoration proceeded. It was the first complete closure since opening as a museum. Staff worried whether visitors would return after such a long interruption, but the alternative, keeping tours running while scaffolding filled rooms and workers dismantled systems, was impossible. Restoration began with engineering. Steel reinforcement was installed where beams showed stress. Foundation cracks were repaired with techniques that wouldn't damage historic fabric. The roof was completely rebuilt with modern waterproofing hidden beneath period-appropriate slate tiles. Chimneys were stabilized and repointed. The limestone exterior received meticulous attention. Each block was assessed. Damaged stones were carefully removed and replaced with matching Indiana limestone. Mortar joints were repointed with mix formulated to match original composition. The goal was invisibility. Repairs should disappear, allowing the facade to appear exactly as it had in 1910. Windows presented enormous challenges. The mansion had hundreds of windows, many large, all custom-made. Original windows from 1910 had been single pane. Restoration in the 1970s had replaced some with early double-pane units. By 2008, none performed adequately. The solution required custom fabrication, new windows matching 1910 designs but incorporating modern insulating glass and weather sealing. Each window was measured individually. None were standard sizes. Inside, rooms were emptied completely. Furniture, rugs, artwork, decorative objects, everything went into climate-controlled storage. This allowed access to floors, walls, ceilings, and systems. Electrical wiring was completely replaced. The old system, installed in stages over decades, had become a dangerous maze of incompatible components. New wiring was concealed in walls and ceilings, routed to avoid damaging historic plaster and woodwork. Plumbing was similarly overhauled. Original fixtures were preserved where possible, but pipes behind the walls were replaced with modern materials. Climate control was completely redesigned using contemporary HVAC technology, concealed in ways that maintained the mansion's historic character. Vents were hidden in decorative grills. Equipment was housed in basement and attic spaces. The ballroom received special attention. This was Nemours' signature space, the room most photographed and most significant to Alfred's story. Walls were examined inch by inch. Damaged plaster was carefully repaired. The ceiling's ornate moldings were cleaned and stabilized. The parquet floor was refinished. Chandeliers were disassembled, cleaned, rewired, and rehung. French doors were rebuilt. The room emerged looking exactly as it had in the 1920s, but structurally sound for the next century. The conservatory required complete reconstruction. The 1970s restoration had extended its life, but by 2008 the structure was failing. The decision was made to rebuild from scratch. The original design was preserved, but execution used modern materials and techniques. New glass provided better insulation. Metal framework was stainless steel painted to match historic color. Modern drainage and irrigation systems were installed. The result looked period appropriate, but would last far longer. Throughout restoration, historians documented everything. Before walls were opened, they photographed existing conditions. When original materials were discovered, early wallpaper fragments, hidden construction details, workers' marks, they were recorded. This documentation serves future researchers studying early 20th century building practices. Paint analysis revealed original color schemes. Microscopic examination of paint layers showed exactly what colors Alfred chose for each room. Some matched existing schemes. Others were surprises. Rooms currently cream had originally been deeper colors. The restoration team faced a choice: restore original colors or maintain familiar later schemes. They chose originals where evidence was clear, carefully documented decisions for transparency. Furnishing the restored rooms required equal care. Everything had been inventoried before storage. Now each piece returned to its documented location. Furniture was placed exactly where photographs from the 1920s and 30s showed it. Rugs were unrolled in precise positions. Artwork rehung at recorded heights. The goal was creating not a generic period room, but Alfred and Jessie's actual home, restored to a specific moment. The project cost $39 million, significantly over initial estimates. Surprises always emerge when restoring century-old buildings, but the foundation remained committed. When costs rose, additional fundraising was authorized. The alternative, incomplete restoration, would have wasted money already spent without solving underlying problems. Nemours reopened in May 2012. Early visitors were astounded by the transformation. The mansion felt simultaneously fresh and historic, clean, but not over-restored. Every room glowed with renewed life while maintaining authentic character. The ballroom in particular stunned visitors. Seeing it fully restored, chandeliers blazing, made clear why Alfred considered it his triumph. Tours now included information about the restoration itself. Docents explained challenges overcome, decisions made, techniques used. This added layer helped visitors understand that preserving historic houses requires constant work. Buildings aren't static objects. They're living organisms needing care, attention, resources. Nemours survived because people chose to invest in its survival. The restoration ensured Nemours would endure another century. Modern systems, properly installed, would serve decades before requiring replacement. Structural repairs addressed problems that could have caused catastrophic failure. The mansion Alfred built to outlast his family's rejection now actually will outlast everyone who knew him, everyone who remembers the divorce scandal, everyone who cared about the feuds that shaped his life. That's the paradox of historic preservation. We save buildings long past the point when original meanings matter to anyone alive. Nemours began as Alfred's wounded response to family exile. It evolved into Jessie's carefully maintained legacy project. Now it exists as public history, educational resource, architectural treasure. Its value has nothing to do with Alfred's personal grievances and everything to do with what it teaches about American wealth, family power, architectural ambition, and the complicated humans who built monuments to their own contradictions. Chapter 10. Walking Through History. Today, approximately 15,000 visitors tour Nemours annually. They arrive by reservation, park in a modern lot hidden from the mansion, and gather in a visitor center built specifically to avoid impacting historic grounds. The tour begins with a short film explaining Alfred's life, the mansion's construction, and its transformation into a museum. Then guests board a small tram that carries them through the gardens to the mansion entrance. The approach matters. Alfred designed the allée of trees to build anticipation, to create a sense of arrival. Modern visitors experience exactly what Alfred intended. The mansion gradually revealing itself, growing larger and more impressive as you draw closer. The limestone facade glows warm gold in afternoon sun. The steep roof with its prominent dormers suggests a French château transported to Delaware soil. First impressions are exactly what Alfred hoped they would be. Entering the main hall, visitors encounter the space Alfred designed to announce his wealth and taste. White marble floors reflect light from tall windows. The grand staircase curves upward with elegant ironwork railings. French walnut paneling glows rich and dark. Ornate plaster moldings frame the ceiling. This is the moment when guests understand Nemours is not just a large house, it's a palace. Docents guide groups through carefully planned routes. The drawing room shows Alfred and Jessie's taste in furniture, French and English antiques, nothing contemporary for its time. Every piece was selected to suggest aristocratic lineage, old money, European refinement. The irony that these were new purchases by new money escapes no one paying attention. The dining room seats its phantom 20 guests. The table is set as if dinner might begin any moment. Limoges china, sterling silver, crystal glasses, all arranged with formal precision. Docents explain that this room, designed for entertaining, rarely saw more than a handful of diners. The staff who set this table daily for decades served meals to empty chairs. The library holds Alfred's book collection. Leather-bound volumes line mahogany shelves from floor to ceiling. A rolling ladder provides access to upper shelves. Comfortable chairs suggest quiet reading, but Alfred's deteriorating eyesight made reading increasingly difficult. This room, like so many at Nemours, represented aspiration more than actual use. The music room contains Jessie's piano. Unlike other rooms frozen as displays, this one feels lived in. Jessie actually used this space. She played regularly, filling the mansion with music. Visitors are told this detail, and suddenly one room becomes real. Here, at least, the house served its intended purpose. Someone sat at that piano and made sound that traveled through empty halls and brought brief warmth to cold grandeur. Upstairs, bedrooms show how Alfred and Jessie actually lived. Their private spaces were less formal than public rooms, more comfortable furniture, personal photographs, books on nightstands. These rooms reveal the humans behind the palace, people who slept, dressed, brushed their teeth, had quiet morning routines in rooms that weren't performance spaces. The guest suites, 10 of them, tell their own story. Most stayed empty, but occasionally friends visited. Business associates stayed over. Family members from Jessie's side made brief appearances. The rooms were always maintained ready. Fresh linens, flowers, everything perfect just in case. The staff kept hope alive that the mansion might someday function as Alfred designed it. The ballroom remains the tour's climax. Docents save it for last, leading groups through a final corridor and then through French doors into the enormous space. The effect is theatrical. Visitors gasp. The room is beautiful, soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, parquet floors, tall windows opening to formal gardens. It's also heartbreaking once you know the story. This room waited 70 years for Alfred to host the parties that would prove his social redemption. They never came. Now 15,000 strangers per year walk through and witness his beautiful, failed hope. Outside, gardens offer different lessons. The formal French landscaping demonstrates wealth's ability to impose order on nature. Every hedge trimmed geometrically, every path perfectly aligned, fountains positioned with mathematical precision. The reflecting pool mirrors sky and architecture. Everything is controlled, designed, intentional. Nothing accidental grows here, but gardens are living things. They require constant maintenance, or they collapse into chaos. The 8 groundskeepers Alfred employed have become 4 in modern times. Still, 4 people work full-time keeping these gardens immaculate. Cut the staff, reduce the budget, and within 5 years the formal precision would vanish under weeds and overgrowth. Gardens, unlike limestone and steel, cannot be restored decades later. They must be continuously maintained or lost. Some visitors come for architecture. They photograph details, admire Carrère and Hastings' work, discuss Beaux-Arts design principles. Others come for gardens. They identify plants, appreciate landscape design, compare Nemours to other great estates. Many come for history, the DuPont story, Alfred's personal drama, the scandal and exile and lonely palace. A few come looking for ghosts. They ask docents whether the mansion is haunted. Does Alfred's spirit pace empty halls? Does Alicia appear in the conservatory? Do phantom parties fill the ballroom at night? The docents answer carefully. No paranormal activity has been documented, but houses this old make sounds. Floorboards creak, pipes knock, wind moans through chimneys. Visitors sometimes hear things they interpret as supernatural. More likely they hear a century-old house settling, expanding, contracting, living its material life. The tours end in the gift shop, naturally. Visitors buy books about DuPont's, postcards of the mansion, coffee mugs with garden photographs. Revenue from the shop helps offset operating costs. Even preserved houses must generate income. The machinery of tourism that keeps Nemours alive requires constant feeding. What do visitors take away? That depends on what they bring. Those sympathetic to Alfred see a man who built something beautiful despite rejection. Those critical see wasteful excess. One family's palace maintained while children elsewhere go homeless. Architecture enthusiasts see a well-preserved example of Beaux-Arts design. Garden lovers see horticultural achievement. History buffs see documentation of Gilded Age wealth and its complicated legacy. Everyone sees empty rooms. That's inescapable. You cannot walk through Nemours without confronting absence, the missing parties, the absent family, the social life that never filled these spaces. The house makes visible what wealth cannot buy: acceptance, belonging, the simple joy of rooms filled with laughter. Some visitors leave moved. They recognize Alfred's pain, understand his choices even if they disagree with them, and appreciate that his fortune ultimately funded a children's hospital that has saved lives. Others leave disturbed. They see resources wasted on personal vanity when people suffered poverty. A few leave inspired. If Alfred could transform his wounds into something this lasting. Perhaps personal pain can become purposeful creation. There's no single correct reading. Nemours resists simple judgments. It exists as Alfred left it, complicated, contradictory, simultaneously impressive, and tragic. A palace that proves you can build anything money will buy, except the life you actually want. That's why preservation matters, not to celebrate wealth or excuse excess, but to keep evidence of human complexity alive. Alfred DuPont was neither hero nor villain. He was a brilliant engineer and stubborn fool, a generous employer and isolated aristocrat, a man who helped arm America's wars and built a hospital for sick children, someone who loved women. His family rejected and died mostly alone despite enormous wealth. Nemours preserves all of this, the beauty and the loneliness, the achievement and the waste, the hope and the disappointment. Walking through it 110 years after completion, visitors, encounter not just architectural history, but human truth, that we build what we think we need, and sometimes discover we needed something else entirely. The mansion stands. The tours continue. Alfred's story is told again and again to audiences who never knew him, don't care about his family feuds, and probably can't imagine living in 47,000 square feet. But they walk his halls, stand in his ballroom, look at his gardens, and perhaps understand something fundamental: that grandeur is no defense against loneliness, that revenge architecture satisfies pride but not soul, and that the best legacy is not the house you built, but what your fortune accomplished after you were gone. The children's hospital that bears Alfred's name has treated hundreds of thousands of patients. That's his real monument. Nemours is just the beautiful, complicated context that helps explain why the hospital exists at all. Thank you for exploring Nemours Mansion with me. If this architectural journey fascinated you, please like and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which estate we should investigate next: Biltmore in North Carolina, Whitemarsh Hall, the lost Stotesbury Palace, the Breakers in Newport, or perhaps another forgotten mansion with secrets waiting to be discovered. Your support makes these deep investigations possible. Until next time.